Revenge of the Black Cloak Society. A King's Quest-based fic. Chapter 7. Sad Homecomings. Shamir Shamazel silently waited in the throne room of Daventry Castle. In all his time being a djinn, his good masters had always allowed him to think, so he could ensure his magic would work best. This was always the case when a djinn had to break their way through opposing magic. If Shamir was under the control of his former master, the vile Abdul al-Hazred, the teleportation would have been easier, but his purposes wouldn't be a noble cause. That was the thing about djinns that his current master, understood. Djinns usually were as noble as their master. Only those that had been owned by truly evil people had been corrupted by dark magic. He had even heard of one djinn that had been corrupted by one member of the Black Cloak Society and longed to be free to cause chaos. He sometimes wondered about that dark djinn, but put it out of his mind as he saw his master and their parents entering the throne room. Shamir waited until they were up to him before he spoke. "Are you both ready for this? I want you to know a little about what you will experience as we teleport." He watched as his master nodded. It would be best to listen to Shamir, in this case, mother and father. If he had not told me what to expect, I might have panicked during the teleportation. He noticed that both the king and queen gave him a slightly worried look. He raised his hands and quickly explained. "Normally, the teleportation spell feels like someone has spun you around for a moment. It is briefly disorienting. However, like what we will be doing, we will feel something pushing us out as we spin. That isn't as bad as trying to push our way in through a magical barrier, which makes the spinning worse, because it feels like someone is trying to stop us. The only real bad combination is going out through one barrier and in through another. It's a combination of both, but we shouldn't have to worry about that." He watched as Queen Valenice nodded. "'Tis a good thing that we won't be experiencing that. Besides, I do hope you can help us rescue my niece when we get there. Having you with us should make rescuing her much easier." He did not argue that. There were very few things that could weaken a djinn's magic. The only thing that could severely weaken a djinn's magic was dark magic, like dark magical barriers, cast from very ancient spellcasters, and they would have to be ready for it. He then watched as Alexander handed his father the bottle that Shamir called home from time to time. If something does go amiss, Shamir can rest in his bottle. However, I hope you don't have to use it. Deep down, Shamir hoped for that as well. After all the freedoms Alexander had given him, Shamir really didn't want to return to his bottle. Once everything was in order, Shamir nodded, and then took both King Graham's and Queen Valenice's hands. "Hold on tight, because we will be in Kalima in no time." He then focused his powers and began the teleportation. As he focused on the spell, he felt the familiar sensation of passing through the dark magic barrier. In the blink of an eye, he knew they had passed through the barrier and were heading for the throne room of Kalima's royal castle. However, as he knew they were nearing it, he felt it. They were passing through another magical barrier. As they passed through it, he fought to make sure the effects were minimal. It would take a lot out of him, but it was needed, or else one of his master's parents would be lost. As the throne room came into view around them, Shamir started to feel faint, and when they were finally in the throne room, he realized that somehow the dark forces that had invaded Daventry had also gone into effect in Kalima. It was the last thing he thought when a darkness overcame him, a very tiring darkness, as he felt his magical body start to collapse. King Graham of Daventry realized what was happening just as the djinn started to collapse. He realized it just as they were teleporting, because the very sensation that the djinn was sure wouldn't happen happened. It had been a painful experience, but his fortitude, despite his age, allowed him to hold on. He was sure that Valenice's resolve came from wanting to help her kidnapped niece. However, he was in better position to catch the collapsing djinn. As he caught the figure, he glanced around for a moment and realized they had made it to the throne room of Kalima Castle. He also noticed that Valenice's brother, King Drake of Kalima, was coming over, obviously concerned. As he quickly noticed the figure, he could tell that King Drake was very different from the old king. While the old king gave off a fierce presence, Drake, with spectacles on his face and an average build, gave off that of a kindly yet wise presence. Before the young king could say anything, Graham looked at him and said, "We need help here, especially a wizard." He then realized that Shamir's breathing had lessened, and he was worried that the attempt had severely wounded the djinn. Just as he held the djinn, he heard King Drake shout, "David, fetch the royal wizard, and guards, get in here to help them." With everything happening so fast, Graham never noticed the messenger in the room, nor anyone else that had been in the room. However, in mere moments, he realized the guards were helping him lie Shamir down. As the guards took over trying to comfort the djinn, he stepped back with his wife and brother-in-law and watched as the messenger came in, followed by a man in black robes. Graham felt a bit apprehensive about it, until the man, whose hair looked a bit slick, looked at the fallen djinn and said, "I take it one of you have the djinn's bottle?" When he nodded, the wizard nodded at the figure and said, "Please place it by the djinn and stand back." When Graham did so, he watched as the wizard closed his eyes, and soon a glowing aura came from the bottle and encircled the djinn. He half wanted to step towards the djinn, but paused when the wizard looked at him. It even chilled his blood when the wizard said, "I wouldn't do that, Your Majesty. The spell I invoked is an old spell, which will heal a djinn enough so they can eventually return to their bottle to fully recover. It is to protect the djinn, and only the djinn's real master can safely breach it. Otherwise, it will destroy whomever approaches the fallen djinn. Once this djinn is healed enough to re-enter the bottle, the protective aura will drop." As he watched the wizard stand up, he heard King Drake say, "What kind of spell is that, to do something so devastating?" He was taken aback when the wizard calmly said, "An old dark spell, but like all magic, its applications are all dependent on the actions of the caster." He then saw the wizard looking at all of them and sigh. "I fear Agatha is getting aid from her fellow members of the Black Cloak Society. This field was not her doing, but it is boosting her power. I may only be able to protect the castle and most of the town." He then noticed that the king looked glum. "Her powers has increased since she abducted Yvette. We aren't sure what spell she used, but we do know how she had gotten into the castle." Graham wasn't surprised when his wife looked at her brother with shock. "You mean she didn't use magic to get in? That makes no sense at all. I was sure she used magic when she abducted me." He was surprised when he heard the next words. There had been an escape passage set up years ago. No one other than the rulers knew about it, but Father made sure Agatha knew about it, since he was in the Black Cloak Society. Graham was shocked when he heard those words. However, it explained a few things. He could tell the old king of Kalima was not very happy at the wedding, but this was something he didn't expect to be the reason for it. Queen Valenice could not believe what her brother had just said, especially now with what was going on. There could be no way those words were true. She looked right at him and said in her sternest voice, "That is not funny in the slightest bit, Drake. There was no way father could have been in that vile society. He was just a man." She was stunned when her brother didn't back down, but stood firm. "A lot came out about father when he died, dear sister. Not even mother was aware of father's dealings with the Black Cloak Society. When she did learn about it, she died of shame. I didn't tell you then, because I knew you'd react like this. Now my daughter, your niece, may pay the price you are meant to pay." Something in those words made Valenice worry. She had always assumed her kidnapping was linked to her beauty, and from what she had heard about Yvette, she was even more beautiful than Valenice at that age. "You mean your daughter was imprisoned for her beauty as well?" She was stunned when her brother shook his head. "No, dear sister. It is nothing like what you were led to believe, like many of us were led to believe. After father died, I learned the truth and discovered all his plans. It seems he had discovered the history of the tower in which you were imprisoned. It is actually the key part of a very dark magic spell. Every so many years, the stars align right for a power-boosting spell to be cast, but it takes the sacrifice of a child filled with magic, and our own family is rich in it, even though we do not use it." She felt her jaw drop open as those last words sunk in, and even though she couldn't fathom that her own father would do it, her husband said the very thing that those words meant. "You mean to say your father meant to willingly sacrifice his own daughter? That is inhuman." She had to agree, but if it was indeed true, it meant that Graham had done more than just rescue her from the tower. He saved her life. She swallowed a lump of fear that was growing in her throat, and then looked at her brother. "How soon until the stars are in proper alignment?" She gasped when her brother answered the question. "A day at best. When I heard you were bringing a djinn with you, I had hoped you could find a way to her quickly. However, I fear that our last hope would be to contact the Good Witch of Kalima." Those words had puzzled her a bit. Her father had never mentioned a good witch in Kalima, but as she thought about it, why would he have if he was a member of the Black Cloak Society? She also remembered the monastery where she and Graham had been married in. Why just her? Whomever she is, why not the monks of the monastery? They should be able to help as well. She was stunned when her brother shook his head. Agatha had gotten rid of them in recent years. Her wolf had turned the last one into a werewolf most recently. Even Scarlet, the good witch, couldn't protect them. However, Scarlet will be able to help. Her powers aren't as strong as her predecessors, but they are strong enough. He noticed a thoughtful look on her husband's face. She was wondering if he had an idea of who this good witch was. "Tell me, did I meet this good witch on my first visit to Kalima, when I rescued Valenice?" When her brother nodded, she saw a smile on Graham's face. "I had a feeling that old lady had been more than she seemed. And I'm betting her granddaughter has now grown into the title." When her brother nodded again, she remembered Graham telling of a girl in a red hood, and she realized who the good witch was, and knew who they would have to see. Agatha looked into her cauldron and watched the scene in the main throne room play out. Inward, the ogress witch was very mad at what had happened. She had not anticipated the royal wizard knowing that ancient spell, but his identity was one that always eluded her when she tried to find it. However, that could wait for a later time. Right now, she needed to prepare to capture the two from Daventry, since it was what Shadrach wanted. For that she knew she would need her minions. She picked up some odd items she kept around her cave, threw them in the cauldron, and begun to stir it up. Soon she noticed that the sky was darkening. She smiled, knowing it would allow all her minions to arrive, since many were creatures of the night. Before she even started casting the summoning spell part of the spell, she saw the dwarf and the sorcerer coming in. Both of their eyes were completely glazed over, since she had fully taken their minds and free will long ago. Next to enter was one of the wolves, and from what she could tell, it was the leader of the pack. Even though it was mostly wolf in appearance, it stood upright like a human. That was a trick that the rest of its pack couldn't do, since she worked her magic on them. Once the local sky was completely dark, the last of her minions came in, looking all high and mighty, despite his pale appearance and the fact that his eyes weren't completely glazed over, nor the wolf's. When they all stood still, she looked at all of them and smiled, which she could see unnerved them. "I see you've all arrived. We have work to do, and very little time to do it in." She walked over to the dwarf and smiled. "My task for you is to find the 3 keys to the mystic doors, and then cross the bridge to the door 8 times. She watched as the dwarf nodded and ran out, eager to complete his task. She smiled, knowing the bridge's mystical nature would not allow anyone to cross more than 7 times. She turned to the sorcerer and smiled. She looked at the figure and issued his commands. "I want you to continue patrolling the eastern forest. If you see Graham, Valenice, or Scarlet, turn them into living statues." She watched as the figure nodded and disappeared in a puff of smoke. After that, she looked at the tall, pale figure. He was a creature of the night, and she knew what he was capable of. She smiled, noticing his fangs had traces of a prior kill on them, and told him her special commands. "I want you to head to the 3 doors and take them to your castle. Once I am done here, I will join you." She watched as the figure nodded, transformed into a bat, and flew off. When the vampire was gone, she looked at the wolf, who was one of her most loyal minions. She patted its shoulders and saw it even wag its tail. "Your task is simple. I want you to hunt down and kill King Graham, Queen Valenice, and that meddlesome Scarlet. I know you've hungered for her for a long time. If they manage to make it to the safety of the monastery, retreat to the castle. I know you can survive the poison waters." The wolf nodded, and then spoke, which didn't surprise Hagatha. "What about the others? Shall they hunt as well?" The voice was rough, but had a good reason for his statement. She turned to the cauldron, knowing she would have to tell Shadrach of this turn of events, but told the wolf her orders. "After you leave, they are instructed to force Graham and Valenice to the edge of the lake the ferryman will be on. That way they will have no chance then to walk into a trap." She heard the wolf howl and then leave, which meant the pack would be hunting soon. She then turned to the cauldron and started to put in different ingredients. She wanted to contact Shadrach and then watch the fun. She still had the remains of the last wayward traveler, and she was sure not all of him was eaten yet. It would make a great snack to watch the royal family of Daventry and that goody two-shoes witch run in horror. Inwardly, she hoped the wolf would at least catch the good witch and turn her into the last werewolf. Scarlet sat in her small cottage, thinking about the recent turn of events in Kalima. For many years after the old king's passing and her own grandmother's passing, her magical powers increased, allowing her to raise a field of protection around the northern part of Kalima and a good portion of the western coast. She was thankful that the royal wizard had worked in secret with her grandmother to help keep some semblance of protection while the old king was alive. In fact, she knew it was him who had allowed King Graham of Daventry to seek out Valenice. However, now that Princess Yvette had been abducted, a change was happening. Of course, the first blow happened before that, when the wolf that tried to take both her and her grandmother increased the size of his pack by hunting down the monks when they were outside their monastery. Eventually, the last monk became part of the pack, and they were somehow locked in the wolf form, while their leader could still maintain a human-like appearance. She put that out of her mind as she returned to her mind to another problem. There was only one set of doors to the tower for a non-magical person to use, and if she figured right, Agatha was hiding the keys, if not destroying them at this point. There was one other option, but she was sure that wouldn't happen, due to the location the door was in. The door was on the other side of a bottomless abyss, and the only way to it was a bridge that would collapse after one crossed it 7 times. To add to the difficulty, the abyss had been charged with a magical barrier. It would take very powerful magic to punch through it, and hers wasn't that powerful yet. If this had happened a few years later, she would have been able to break through the magical barrier, but not now. Her musings were cut short when she noticed the sky to the south was getting darker by the minute. Deep down she knew it was the work of Agatha, and that usually meant something bad was going to happen. She quickly got up and ran over to the nightstand by her bed. As she searched through it, she knew that an attack was coming, and the cottage wasn't completely safe. That evil wolf had already tried to get in during the past. She knew that now she would have to venture to the monastery. When she had everything together, she started to wonder if King Graham and Queen Valenice of Daventry had arrived. The royal messenger had arrived back from Daventry, saying they were coming, and the royal wizard told her they might be coming to her. And if they were venturing here now, they could be in mortal peril. With that worry in her mind, she ran over to a cabinet and pulled out a few talismans that could repel werewolves. The only downside was they would not keep back the big wolf. She also pulled out a cape that her grandmother had. The cape had the distinct charm on it that made anyone think that the wearer was the vampire of the castle in the center of the poison lake. It was different than her own red cape, but she needed to make sure she had it, just in case. When she had the cape, she froze when she heard a knock at the door. For a brief moment, she was afraid it was the wolf, and then remembered the fiend wouldn't knock. At least she was sure the wolf would not knock on her door. But if it wasn't the wolf, it meant it could only be 2 people she was expecting. And right now, they were all facing a dangerous threat. She quickly put all the items in a basket, not amazed as she was as a little girl at how much it held and ran for the door. When she opened the door, she wasn't surprised to see the two people she expected there. King Graham, Queen Valanice, I'm glad to see you, but we need to run towards the monastery. The coming darkness brings a dangerous attack, and this cottage isn't safe. She noticed a worried look on their faces, but she started towards the monastery, knowing they would follow to the safety.